You might wonder why the first photograph up there is a picture of Harrods. If your wife is not dreadfully keen, and that's an understatement, on aeroplane museums, you have to think of something that keeps the boss happy. There it is, folks. Doesn't cost too much, or maybe it does. So, Margaret went to Harrods, I went to Hendon. During my time in the UK, I visited Hendon, Duxford, the de Havilland Museum in Salisbury Hall, the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton, the Biggin Hill Aerodrome, and Old Warden. Margaret came on a couple of those. They were the short visits. I didn't get to Coningsby, to Cosford, to Lincolnshire, where the Just Jane Lancaster is, or to Gainsborough, where the Vulcan is. So there's a good reason to go back to the UK. So with Margaret happily ensconced, at least I imagine, at Harrods, so I jumped on the tube. And by then I'd been in the UK for a few days and I felt like a bit of a veteran with the tube. So 3 changes of the tube from Kensington and out into the sunshine at Hendon. Half a mile on the bus with some other Australians, and there we were at the London RAF Museum in Hendon. It only takes 2 or 3 minutes on the bus from the tube station, and there we went. Incidentally, my first question to the guys there, I said, they are plastic ones, aren't they? And he said, why do you ask? And I said, they're surely too expensive and too precious these days to have real ones poked up on poles. Happy to say that yes, indeed, they are plastic ones. There's the entrance, very impressive, I thought. The spit is also a replica. But there was the entrance to Hendon. There are several parts to the museum, so there's different hangars, different sections, and some outdoor stuff as well. Walking in, you're first greeted by Mr. Blério's aeroplane and numerous other bits and pieces, but most of all, just have a look at how clean and beautiful that is. Everybody who works in the place is just simply passionate about the aeroplanes that are there. We'll be fairly quick because this is just simply a walk through and some of the stuff that is in there. Doesn't spoil you for a visit, let me tell you. You could spend 2 days there if you can afford it where your wife's at Harrods. Beautiful P-51 Mustang, made by North American for the RAF, modified by a Rolls-Royce Merlin to make it a great aeroplane. Brian will tell you that's not actually a favourite topic of the Americans. When we were in the museum in Dayton, Ohio, Brian made mention to the chap, or asked the question, didn't that have an English engine? And he said, no, it was made by Packard in the US of A. Mosquito, beautifully presented. Sad to say, like all of the Mosquitoes, when they were inspected, numerous separations within the fuselage, but of course, air-conditioned environment, it keeps very, very well indeed. The people in the place just simply wander around and you can see them dusting and polishing and talking, and they're all so keen about the place, and just look at how clean the place is. This is incidentally the first gallery that were there. When you look at this at the ground level, because you walk in, as you can see, up the back there is a overhead gallery, so you can walk around and have a look at some bits and pieces there. You can see all the bits and pieces from the raised gallery. The only issue is, as a keen photographer, everything's packed in a little bit tightly, as you imagine, and it does take a little bit to work your way through. When you come to an aircraft and you see a little notation in the corner that says "Sop with Snipe," that's because I had to go back and look it up and see exactly what sort of aeroplane it was. I'm a great enthusiast of the World War II aeroplanes. I'm sad that Murray Fletcher isn't here, or maybe not, because he's my go-to guru on World War I aeroplanes, and there's a couple of those that I wasn't sure of. That's a Fokker D7, complete with the genuine fabric that was used by the factory. I don't know why, but if you go to the Australian War Memorial Museum in Canberra, one of those there, the same fabric. And I'm reliably told that that's what Fokker put on their aeroplanes. Anybody know why? No, me neither. Now there's the one I need a bit of help with. This is one of the Hawker family of aeroplanes. It could be a Hawker Hart, it could be a Hawker Hart trainer. Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, V12, would have been a whole lot of fun to fly, I'm quite sure. And that was a Between the Wars aircraft. One of just a handful remaining. This is the Hawker Tempest. What a magnificent aeroplane. A finer, thinner wing than the Typhoon. There'd probably only be 3 or 4 of these in existence. Mr. Kermit Weeks, one of my heroes in the US of A, is actually working to put one of those back in the air. He's got an awful lot of money, he added, unnecessarily. One of my whinges with the museum. That aeroplane was a magnificent warrior. It was a fabulous aeroplane. Why on earth present it in target tug, towing colours? That should be down on the floor in camouflage. Yeah, it's just my opinion. The aircraft was a great V1 killer. That was a nasty little chap, and it was referred to in the days as the diver by the RAF boys. Father of the cruise missile, of course, and yet another indication of how talented some of the German people were. It would do 400 miles an hour. It had a little pulse jet on the back made by Fieseler, the people who made the Fieseler Storch, just for a one-way trip. It killed an awful lot of people. Called the diver, of course, because what it did is it took off on a ramp pointed at the English capital. It had a very, very basic autopilot, just maintained a heading until it ran out of fuel. At that point, the engine stopped and it glided down, hopefully out of the way, but unfortunately many of them did not. Still in that first gallery, we run into the Messerschmitt 262, a really magnificent aeroplane, the first operational jet fighter, 100 miles an hour faster than anything we had. Isn't it a good thing we owe a great vote of thanks to Mr. Hitler, because when it first came out in 1939 as a tail-wheel aeroplane, he vetoed it because he thought it was completely unnecessary. A little later, when he was presented with it, he said, "Where do I put the bombs? Because it'll make a good bomber." For all of those reasons, the aeroplane never went into production till far too late. Something we should all be very, very thankful for. Twin-engine aeroplane had a real problem with engines. They were made of substandard material because the Germans just simply didn't have them. Typical engine life was about 10 hours. That's if it got that far. At 10 hours they were changed, so they must have had a hell of a lot of engine. It had a set of leading edge slats, but one of the errors they made was they didn't put any brakes, any dive brakes on the thing, and when they came into land, their only option with these engines was to make a long approach. What the Germans did on those long approaches was they laid a huge flak barrier to the runway, so if anybody came in behind them, as people did, and tried to take them out, they got short shift from the airport. But a very, very good aeroplane, and as I say, we should thank Uncle Adolf that he didn't do the right thing, because that could have given our people a lot more trouble than it did. When you consider that engine that you just looked at there on the right, and look at the engine behind the Meteor there, it gives you an idea, because that axial flow engine is really a very, very nice design, and had they had the bits that they needed, it could have been a problem. That's the Meteor's engine, which is Brent Whittle's device, at least in the early ones, and yeah, very brilliant device notwithstanding, but yeah, the Germans had already poached a lot of his ideas and made them work for them. Another picture of the Meteor on the ground, very early model. Enormously successful aeroplane. Gloucester sold them all over the world post-war. It was a very, very good aeroplane in its day. Once again, sitting on the ground, gives you a good look at how well those people kept their museum. A Heinkel 162, made more out of wood than anything else, referred to as the People's Fighter. They banged them out pretty quickly, and again, sad to say for them, but not for us, too late in the conflict to do any good. And although they had a few of them, by that time they were running out of fuel. They didn't have much going for them at all. Some communications aeroplanes, navigation trainers, wireless operator trainers. There's the Percival Prentice. For those of you that are familiar with the Proctor, you can see there's a great deal of similarity between the old Proctor and that World War II aircraft. The Airspeed Oxford, Brian was just talking about that Amy Johnson was lost flying. Yeah, a very, very good aeroplane, very similar in size to the Anson, and once again, a training aircraft. Cute little Hillman sitting alongside it. I couldn't resist taking a photograph just of the motor car. The Lysander, not so famous in these colours, but really one of the very early short takeoff and landing aircraft. A brilliant aeroplane by Westland. When you have a look at the wing, it's a really interesting wing because it's got a couple of tapers on it. Very, very long, high-lift wing. It's more famous in this guise, of course, because the Lysander was the spy plane. You just imagine in the dark of night flying somewhere into Europe. Everything is shut down, there are no lights anywhere. And you're flying several hundred miles to a paddock somewhere near a river or a lake or a town, lit by some resistance fighters with about 3 torches. And you're going to land this aeroplane in that place. Very, very brave people. Very, very brave people who are getting out and staying. And they recovered them as well. This was a favourite of mine. Not many of these around. The Handley Page Halifax. There is in fact one complete Handley Page Halifax. That's in Canada. Wasn't actually an actual aeroplane. It's been assembled from parts, but the Canadians have done a wonderful job. This is all that remains apart from that one. The aircraft was shot down on a raid on the Tirpitz in Norway. It landed on, I'm not sure whether it was a fjord or a lake, but it was frozen. Most of the crew got out. The tail end Charlie I don't think did, which is very, very typical and very sad. It sank in the lake in the 1940s. In the 1970s, I was a member of the British Sub-Aqua Club. I learnt to say British Sub-Aqua Club. They mounted, the UK, or one of the UK mob, mounted a mission to go and recover this from about 80 feet, I think, from memory. And they used 44-gallon drums and air compressors and ropes and all sorts of things, and they dragged her up from below. She was treated and sprayed with some sort of preservation stuff, which is obviously worked very well because that's the best part of 50 years since that was done. And she has just been put there in a crashed diorama showing the effects. That's one of the outer wing panels that broke off when they lifted it up. I think you can appreciate at the bottom of the water for a long time sitting on the sand, it gets full of sand, and one of the great challenges is to try to get the thing up without it all breaking up into pieces. The only thing that was actually restored was one of their Rolls-Royce Merlin 20s that came out of the aircraft. That's been restored, treated, and next to the aeroplane. That I thought was a really magnificent item to have a look at. The Halifax's more famous sibling, of course, is the Lancaster, and there are a lot of Lancasters that survive. There are two that are airworthy, one more that is being built towards being airworthy. Battle of Britain Memorial Flight has an airworthy example. The Canadians have an airworthy example, which by the by is from the Aero Naval, and that's the sister aircraft of the one that's at Bull Creek. This is just one example. Something I didn't know, the two little ports that you can see there on the bomb aimer's position, and one of the attendants said to me, "You know what they're for?" I said, "No, I don't." And he said during their work in formation, if they caught sight of another aircraft below or above in front of them, they just used to flash a series of torch lights through there just as an identifier to the rear gunner to let them know that they were the good guys and not to throw lead at them. The people have a lot of fun on poor old Herman the German's behalf. No enemy plane will fly over the Reich territory. Hermann Goering, as I recall, he actually said, if any aircraft fly over the Reich, you can call me Mia, donkey. Don't know that anybody actually did, or certainly not to his face, but there we go. One of Barnes Wallace's creations was the Grand Slam. Not sure how many of you have seen, there's a very famous bit of footage of a Lanc carrying a Grand Slam, 10 tonnes, which is considerably overweight for a Lancaster. And there's a picture of it bombing a viaduct in Europe. The aeroplane is flying with this thing. It wasn't in the bomb bay, it was carried semi-externally, and there is a serious dihedral on the wings. When they press the button to release the bomb, the wings spring back and you can just about hear the aeroplane sigh with relief. But would I like to be on the receiving end of that? Not a lot. What they have to do is get it reasonably close to the big railway viaduct, which they did. Earthquake bomb took the lot out. Very, very effective device. Tail end Charlie's position, in a lot better condition than how the poor old fella had. The turret's just simply perspex, and inevitably on a curve of pursuit, where's the attacking aeroplane going to finish up? Behind the aeroplane throwing bullets at him. So yeah, brave people in there. I've had to sit in the one at Bull Creek in the tail end Charlie's position, and even in the museum it feels just really lonely back there. You can imagine what it felt like at near 30,000 feet over Germany at night with no heater. Exceedingly uncomfortable. The one that has no representation at all is this bloke, the Short Stirling. The first of the 4-engine heavies. There is not one that survives. And in fact, when you go through the history of aeroplanes that the Brits and the Americans put together, it's amazing how many of them there are only photographs remaining. The Stirling is one of them. The Yanks, of course, had several of their own. 2 of them are at Hendon. There is the B-24 Liberator. Amongst its drivers, the the actor Jimmy Stewart. He used to fly these things during World War II, along with lots and lots of other people. Perhaps not well known, more of these were made than any other Allied aircraft in that class, by a long way. B-17 was there, obviously the Lancaster was there, but this was just miles in front. How did they do that? They got the automotive people to make them, didn't they? If you've ever seen a picture of Willow Run, Ford's manufacturing item, General Motors' effort on B-17s, they were churning out at maximum production 1 an hour. Not a bad effort. The automotive people didn't think a lot of the way the aviation people made aeroplanes. They did a better job. It is said with the Merlin that the Packard Merlin, which was made by General Motors, you could always pick the difference. A, all the parts fitted exactly. B, the American ones didn't leak oil. That's a bit mean, isn't it? But there you go. There's a B-17, you'll see it in the background. There's a lot of things there that simply aren't on our piece. All right, now I had this listed up as something else, but I didn't get it right. It's a biplane pusher. Obviously one of the problems that they had was the lack of synchronisation of the machine guns through the propeller. Terribly embarrassing if you have to shoot yourself down by taking your own propeller off. This thing you can see, the skipper sat the back a little bit higher. The gunner, they hadn't have thought about fixed guns at that stage. The gunner sat in the front because he had a clear field of fire. But boy, when you have a look at these things, bamboo, wire and rag. Brave boys that flew things like this, and with no parachutes either. They didn't initially encourage parachutes. They thought that the crew would jump out. They may well have been right. Come back to thinking about that, but just think about the aeroplane itself and the construction of that. And these things, you know, are just a little over 100 years old. I like that. Presented by His Highness the Nizam of Hyderabad. And you can see there, that's a DH-9. Incidentally, those survived a long time after the war. The Yanks made them. They used them as mail planes in the early 20s. Very good aeroplane. However, 2 seats, primarily an observation aeroplane. The powers that be in the Army and Navy did begrudgingly admit that aeroplanes were okay for looking down at the battle and reporting. They weren't much good for anything else, according to them. Go past World War I and we get to the magnificent Bristol Bulldog. Good-looking aeroplane. This is the one that cost Douglas Bader his proper legs and got tin legs after he rolled one a bit too low and put it into the deck. A lot more metal, still got fabric on it, but not nearly so much wood in the construction. I was really tickled with all that stainless steel, so beautifully formed, and that stainless steel is only a few thousandths of an inch thick. I think it was about 6 thousandths of an inch, which is about 0.15 of a millimetre in the new money. That's really, really thin, but obviously everything had to be light. As we walk through those post-World War I aeroplanes, come to things like the Hawker Hart trainer. Again, I knew this because I zoomed in on the little tag there, kept a log on that. Would have been a lot of fun. V12 Rolls-Royce engine, the Kestrel engine, just one engine away from one of the best aeroplane engines they ever made. The Gloucester Gladiator, last of the biplane fighters. There is at least one that still remains airworthy at the Shuttleworth collection. Everybody at the place who flies it at Shuttleworth describes it as one of the nicest flying aeroplanes they ever made. Half their luck. The North American Harvard, lots and lots of these exist in museums and also in flying conditions. Peter Yates over there, he had a copy that he flew himself, the North American T6, essentially the same aeroplane with a few little bits and pieces, and the SNJ, which was the Navy version. When you look at them, unless you're right up with the tiny little changes, essentially the same aeroplane. My mate John Brown says North American make really good aeroplanes. I'm not arguing. And inevitably, a tiger moth. There is always a tiger moth. There are still thousands of these things in the air. And just by the by, after the war, you could buy one for 150 quid. They had an awful lot of them left over. If you wanted to buy one now, you'll pay for a good one somewhere north of $100,000. Geoffrey de Havilland would have been so pleased. We all know the tiger moth. The Aero Club has got a beautiful example named after ship. And this is where we got to next. You know, you think about the difference between those wooden wire aeroplanes and aeroplanes like the Messerschmitt 109. There's 20 years. 20 years of development took you from something that sort of flew to something that very definitely flew. The great honour of that aeroplane, of course, is it started the combat. In 1939 it was still fighting till they ran out of fuel in 1945. Excellent aeroplane. This particular one, Black 6, was an airworthy example. It used to fly very regularly on the UK air scene. However, one day the mighty Daimler-Benz engine quit. The chap who was flying it, Air Force guy, his name escapes me now, thought he could put it down in a paddock, pop the gear down and put it down in a glide. I don't think they glide very well. Sad to say, the wheels finished up in a bit of a hole and the aeroplane went over on its back. The crew arrived with crash axes and the guy in the cockpit who turned everything off said, don't. The aeroplane's all right, nothing's going to catch on fire. Go and get the lift. They lifted the aircraft up, picked it up, turned it over. There was a lot of damage on it, but it survived. It wouldn't have done if they'd cut him open. Sorry, cut the aeroplane open. He wouldn't have survived then. Very impressive that the guy thought enough to preserve the aeroplane, and the failure of the engine really wasn't his fault at all. There's the picture. Unlike the Merlin, which, if you like, sat upright, this is the Daimler-Benz 601 to 605, and that's an inverted V12. Interestingly enough, if you watch the film The Battle of Britain, and almost everyone has, you'll see that they actually fly a Spanish version of that aeroplane. And that's got a Merlin in the front of it, because by then, in the 50s, didn't have any more Daimler-Benz engines. And it's a really odd-looking aeroplane. They call it a Bucon, and it has a Merlin engine at the front. So from the firewall back, it looks pure Messerschmitt 109. From the firewall forward, it looks pure Spitfire, the Spitschmitt, and things like that they call it, or the Messerschmitt. The American P-40 Kitty Hawk, there's really quite a reasonable representation of American aircraft in the museum. Allison rather than a Merlin engine, although there is an example, the last of them, which I think from memory is a P-40C, that actually has a Merlin in them. One of those over in Tyre. Looks a little different. The Judd, the P-47, what a huge aeroplane. People who flew it loved it. He said, one of the guys I listened to said, you might listen to those guys talking about the Mustang being the Cadillac of the air. And he said, these are like a Ford truck. He said, you put a bullet through that radiator in the Mustang, you're going to spend the rest of your time in a prisoner of war camp. Put a bullet through this, there's more cylinders to take you home. They were a great set of enthusiasts for the big Republic fighter. My late father said he was talking to an American mechanic, and he said, well, Mr. Flight Lieutenant, he said, that aeroplane has got 1,200 electrical connections, each one connecting one source of trouble to another. Now, this was the reason, the primary reason I went to Duxford. This is the one and only Hawker Typhoon. How lucky was I? 3 months after I was there, it went off to the Beesford Restoration Centre for a bit of a pretty up. It disappeared off to Canada for 4 years. It has just come back, and now, for reasons known to themselves, it's at the other RAF Museum at Cosford. I think it's an amazingly beautiful aeroplane, bit of a brutal thing. There she is on the other side. Fabulously quick, and again, was going to be the successor to the Hurricane. It really didn't work like that, but it finished up being a fabulous ground attack aeroplane. I was wandering around thinking how you could get a good photograph of it, and there was a set of stairs with red carpet on them. And I said to the fellow who was in charge, how about letting me step over that rope, go up there and take some pictures? And he said, my back's turned, and he said, but I better not be able to see up there when it turns back again. So I scuttled up the stairs, took a couple of pictures and said thank you, to which he replied, for what? Very, very nice people. I enjoyed that a lot. He said to me afterwards, he said, you're something to do with engineering, aren't you? And I said, oh, a little bit. And he said, anybody who spends that much time looking at that big lump is obviously something to do with engineering. That's the Napier Sabre. The Rolls-Royce Merlin had V12. It was 1,650 cubic inches. This thing was about double that. It is a 24-cylinder engine. So you just imagine a V engine, a V12, bent flat. So you've got a horizontally opposed 12-cylinder engine. There are now 6 cylinders on this side of the crankshaft, 6 cylinders on that side of the crankshaft. You then take another one of those engines and you put that underneath. And then you take the 2 crankshafts and you gear them up, top and bottom, to the prop shaft. Instead of poppet valves, you put sliding valves, okay, ports, the sleeve valve engine. This was the Napier Sabre engine. Phenomenally compact, however, you want to make better than 2,000 horsepower, that worked. Very reliable, didn't like the cold weather much. If it was really freezing, the poor old Irks had to run out every now and then, every hour or so, fire it up, get some warmth in it. They didn't do that. You tried to fire it up, it would break some bits in the aeroplane. Very expensive. There is Kermit Weeks endeavouring to get a Tempest in the air. So very, very much the same engine. There is a bunch of folks in the UK endeavouring to get a Typhoon in the air. They have got millions of dollars. I really hope to live to hear it run. I would love to hear that engine run. I think it'd sound fantastic. A little further along, the Bristol Beaufighter. Awfully tough to try and take a photograph of a Beaufighter. It's all these forward engines. Wonderful torpedo bomber. Okay, great ground attack aeroplane. The Japanese used to call it the Whispering Death. Probably better photographed from the tail like that. And it gives you an idea. Very, very successful aeroplane. Sort of in the Mosquitoes League. Wonderful night fighter. Those of you know of John Cunningham, the fellow who went on to test the Comet. Wonderful book on night fighting and Bristol Beaufighter. Loved the aeroplane. Once again I found a ladder. And when you scuttle up the ladder, get a much better photograph of it because you can actually see the front. Single seat at the front. Very cute. When you get in the thing, on the roof, there are a couple of parallel bars. You hoik yourself up, lower yourself into the front seat. How do I know that? Over in Moorabbin, They've got one of those. Slow day at the RAF Museum, and the young bloke said to me, go and have a sit in the Beaufighter, and he told me about it. About 3 years later, I was over in New Zealand having a look around the Christchurch Museum. There's a dear old guy there as one of the guides, and he said, go and have a talk to old Fred. He used to fly Beaufighters during the war. And I talked to old Fred, and we talked about getting in the Beaufighter, and a big grin came over his face, and he said, well, I'd forgotten about that. He said, I'm not sure that I'd be able to do that these days. I know how he feels. Howard Wheatley's aeroplane, the Beaufort. Museums are kind of unfair. I'd never seen a Beaufort in my life before. If I just had one of those to look at, I would have wandered around it for half an hour. Because I was in so much distinguished company, I sort of took a photograph of it and continued on. You really need a lot more time. I don't know that I would have got a lot of agreement from that from the chief. The Lockheed Hudson, there's one airworthy example in the world. It lives in Temora at the Temora Museum in New South Wales. You ever over there, go to the Temora Museum on a flying day. They've got a lot of really good stuff. The Hudson was really a development of Lockheed's between the wars passenger aeroplanes. So there's a turret that you can't really see because it's behind that fin. But if you have a look at the Lockheed 10, the Lockheed 12 and the Lockheed Electra, you can see the family lineage. That's where the Hudson came from. The Fairy Battle. And once again, had I ever seen a battle before? No, not surprising. I think there's only two in existence. A V12 Merlin powered, beautiful to fly. My late uncle, who used to fly Blenheims, Mosquitoes, DC-3s and other, he said it was the nicest aeroplane he'd ever flown. Unfortunately, it was developed pre-war. By the time the war arrived, it just simply wasn't up to the job. They had a tough time with the opposition. And typically, you know, they would go out on a mission in France before the Dunkirk invasion, and only one or two of 6 or 7 of them would come back, which is very, very sad indeed. Quick look at some of those Butte V12 engines. The Rolls-Royce R. Schneider Trophy Racing engine. Some of you would be familiar with the Supermarine S series, the S5, the X6 and the S6B. This is the engine that ran it, and as the folks said on the doco on the engine, Rolls-Royce at this stage was only one more engine away from the best engine it ever made. The Rolls-Royce Kestrel fitted into those Hawker biplanes, reasonably powerful engine, but nothing to where the Merlin was. On the other hand, we have things like the Bristol Hercules engine, one of a relative handful of English radial engines. Finished up in the Sea Fury, in the Beaufighter, interestingly enough in the Lancaster. They made one series of Lancasters with 4 radials and things like the Beaufort and so forth. Very, very good engine, very smooth. Boy, when you have a look in the back, it looks like somebody making a Swiss watch went berserk. There's little levers and cams and things all over the place. But very good. As I say, the Japanese used to call the aeroplane the Whispering Death because it really was very, very quiet. There's the famous Merlin. There are numerous examples of it around Hendon. So you get to have a look at Merlins. I was intrigued to see this particular display because there's a Merlin with the cylinder head off. Those of you that have a bit to do with aeroplane engines, most of them manufactured radials, the air-cooled, you can't take the cylinder head off. Merlin, yeah, a lot more in common with the automotive type arrangement. You can see they've just got some hold downs there, those yellow bits. They hold the cylinder lock down on the crankcase below. And that just has the engine's cylinder head off, so you can see that the left-hand bank of the engine has all of those exposed, and you can see the 6 pistons down in the cylinder. On the other side is the cylinder head on the engine. And if you look right on the end there, that large gear you can see is driving the camshaft which operates the poppet valves. We still have the same thing in motor cars, but when I was there, I heard a young bloke, well, a young bloke, bloke about my age, behind me say, "My God, it's got a shaft drive camshaft." And his mate said, "Yeah, so what?" And he said, "They used to work on those in bloody Wolseley's. They were forever going wrong." But they didn't on the Merlin. It was very, very good indeed. Last of the series was the Griffin. The Griffin was a bigger engine, a development. It was much, much more powerful. It was actually a brand new engine. There were no interchangeable parts. But again, that beautiful V12 smoothness. Interestingly enough, when I was at Duxford, Stephen Gray, a man of great wealth, was just having a little bit of fun in his Mark 14 Spitfire doing circuits, as you would if you had that much dough. And that was in a Griffin engine one. I've heard a lot of Merlins run, never heard a Griffin run. It's got a much more harsh note. Still sounds pretty cool. There's two examples. That's the very engine that I used as one of the photographs. The aircraft in the foreground is an earlier model Spitfire. You can see it's just got 3 exhausts each side, 2 cylinders into each exhaust. The one at the back with the very non-traditional bubble canopy, almost all of them, you're probably aware, had that Malcolm hood there. But that's the Mark 14, which is the one I saw Stephen Gray flying. And when you have a look at the engine, you realise it's quite cool in that even the hot rod kids would like it, because right at the front there's a couple of little nifty bumps. If you look at the top there, you can see there's a little raised section, looks just like some hot rod kid there put a couple of whizzo bits on it, and those bumps there on the cowl are to accommodate that slightly bigger engine. Boy, when you have a look in there, there's an awful lot of stuff in there. It always fascinated me how much of that stuff they must have been able to do without, because there were people came back with bullets through all of that stuff, and yet the aeroplane generally seemed to keep running. This, I thought, was really terrific. You may not be close enough, but this was a book of the 1932 to 1945 Supermarine Flight Test Group. And it mentions such people as R.J. Mitchell, the chief designer initially of the Spitfire, Joe Smith, who took over as chief designer after R.J. Mitchell succumbed to cancer. It's a lovely little moment that when his son came to him and said, "Dad, they've got a name for your new fighter." And he said, "Yeah, what's that?" And he said, "They've called it the Spitfire." And Mitchell's comment was, "Yeah, that's just the sort of bloody stupid name they would give it." Apparently he didn't think a lot of it. Test pilots, Alec Henshaw, if you've ever read the book Cipher of Merlin, wonderful read. He flew almost half the aeroplanes that came out of the big Castle Bromwich works. Geoffrey Quill and Mutt Summers, the test pilots of the Spitfire. There's just a wonderful little piece of history. That tickled me a lot. That was presented to the museum by the Supermarine Works, because Supermarine. There's the V1. Fascinating little piece of kit. There is lovely stories on that being told about the V1 being tipped to upset its autopilot. A lot of people say, the Beaumont and Company used to put their wing underneath the V1 and hit the wing. If you did that, the wing would fall off the Tempest as well. But no, they didn't do that. They just put the wing gently underneath it and then raised the wing, and the airflow rolled the V1. As soon as it got over about 25 degrees, it would roll into the deck. Hopefully you did that where it wasn't going to do any damage where it landed. For those of you that have heard me prattle on about the Sonax and making the wings, there's what's inside the wings of the V1. Exactly the same thing. Ribs, Not very much in the way of a spar, but hey, they only had to make one trip and then only one way. Over to the jets, there's the Meteor, talked about that earlier. Very, very successful, as I say, post-war. That's the Meteor 8. They've lost a Meteor, that's the one. De Havilland Vampire in both single-seat and two-seat versions. The single-seaters were fighters, very, very effective and a good aeroplane for de Havilland. Sold a lot of them overseas. The twin-seaters, of course, served with the RAF right up into the 70s as their trainer before they were overtaken with the Mackies. Wooden nose, incidentally, as a tribute to the Mosquito, I suppose. But yeah, a bit of a problem for restoring them. They had one on a plinth at Pierce, and sad to say the nose just fell off one day onto the ground. Probably one of the prettiest aeroplanes made, the lovely Hawker Hunter, amongst the best looking aeroplanes around. Again, very good aeroplane for hawkers, sold an awful lot of those. We're talking 50s, early 60s. The English Electric Canberra survived all the way to become a bomber in Vietnam. The longest serving example in the RAF made it within a few months of 50 years. That particular one was the air race winner from London to New Zealand with, as you can see, a stop in Perth for fuel. Top aeroplane in its day. The mighty Avro Vulcan, that gives you an idea of the challenge to try and take photographs. That is tucked literally in the corner. That refuelling probe is about 6 inches from the wall. The tin triangle, they called that, and that had a bomb load that they talked about for the mission to the Falklands Islands. I don't think the Argentinians are all that pleased about that display. The English Electric Lightning, along with our previous discussion about a trip from the wooden wire aeroplanes to the Spitfire, Messerschmitt and Hurricanes, 20 years, taken another 20 years. We're running around in this thing in 1959. 2 jets, one on top of the other, a Mach 2 aeroplane. A very quick wander through the air sea rescue area. The mighty Sunderland, you can see that the turret goes back so that the guy can pop out, pick up the mooring buoy, or buoy as the Americans would have it said. And there's that turret wound right back. Impressive aeroplane. Some of you might even remember Carolyn Winton Rhodes' talk. Her dad was a Sunderland skipper, as indeed was Andy Anderson. Yeah. That's really interesting. You want to get bombs, flares or depth charges out of a Sunderland, you put them on, wheel them out and drop them off. It really worried me a little when I saw a parachute exit. I dare say if some important parts of the aeroplane had fallen off or it was on fire, you probably would be happy to leap out there, but it looks a wee bit hazardous. Supermarine Walrus, beautiful example of that, RAF Museum in Point Cook. If you ever get a chance, have a squiz. The other means of fishing our crew out of the drink, of course, was the air sea rescue boats. How were they powered? A marinised version of the Merlin. Not sure why the V2 rocket lived in here, but there you are, the father of the ICBM. Very quick walk through the Graham White factory. These are the World War I guys. There it is. You walk out the back, and that's the hangar. Again, have a look at the floor. I asked the guy how many of these things were real, how many were replicas. He didn't like the way I put that, and he did say that more than 3/4 of them were real aeroplanes. There isn't anything in there that's under 100 years old. The Vickers Vimy, they flew this thing. Keith and Ross Smith flew it from England to Australia. So if you're sitting in the back seat of a jet, belly aching about what a lousy seat the economy seat is, just think about sitting out in the open with those 2 big Rolls-Royce Eagles, which you hope are going to keep going for the next 30, 40 hours. You realise, now you've got nothing to complain about. Notice we've now reached the stage, the Bristol M1C monoplane, kind of unusual. The SE5, very, very successful aeroplane, single-seater, and you can see if you note the machine gun it fires through the prop. The Sopwith Pup, Australian made. Now that doesn't refer to all of them, that's just some of them. That particular one apparently was made, I think, in Bankstown, they said. Sopwith Dolphin, you might have heard of it. I must confess I hadn't. It has some kind of a V8, I think it's a Hispano-Suiza V8 engine in it. Avro 504K, those of you who are enthusiastic tailwheel aeroplane flyers, have a look at the required bits that you need for flying an aeroplane with the wheel at the back. The anti-nose over device, not that it has any brakes, and the or the ground loop damage reduction unit. I've got one with a wheel at the front. Am I a chicken? You better believe it. That's the Huck starter. Now how's that for a keen little piece of gear? There's a clutch on that chain-driven shaft. The driver would come out, engage it on the propeller of the aeroplane, put the clutch in for the Huck starter and turn it over. I've seen a small version for model aircraft engines that people hold in their hands. No starter motors, and that was the alternative to the good old Armstrong starter. The RE8, that one for you. So yeah, there's the RE8 that Delia's great uncle, sad to say, passed away flying in Bathsheba. Again, successful aeroplane. The Albatross D5, just finished one of those for Kermit Weeks by the aviation crowd in New Zealand. They've built a completely genuine replica of that aeroplane, a really good looking piece of gear. The BE-2B, I don't know anything about it, but I do know that the presentation of that aircraft was probably, in my opinion, the Rolls Royce of the place. It just looked fantastic. The Vickers FB5, I believe they called it the gun bus, I think. But again, these were the aircraft there that these people flew in. A Caudron G3, little short fuselage, single-seater in this case, and it looks moderately fragile to me. And finally the Sopwith triplane. I didn't even know that Sopwith did a triplane. I knew all about the red one that the Red Baron flew. Couple of pictures there from 100 years ago, and this was from the Sopwith Works. These are the ladies who covered the fuselages and the wings in their linen covering. Isn't it a fantastic thing that somebody thought to capture some of these scenes in photographs? How they made a prop in the old days. Everything you look at was a really, really tedious process. Laminated propeller, all of those laminations glued, clamped together, and then of course machined to make the propeller. Finally, just a couple of views from the Battle of Britain gallery. Behind on that big screen is where they have an AV production, which is really super, relating to the Battle of Britain, the Hurricane and of course the Spitfire. Looking at the Germans, Heinkel 111, not very many genuine ones survived. Again, the Battle of Britain one, they had Merlins in them. The Messerschmitt 109, they broke an awful lot of those aeroplanes getting them on and off the ground. Look at that little skinny undercar, it's about as wide as a tiger moth, got treachery written all over it. The Messerschmitt 110, the Germans hoped that this was going to be as good as the Mosquito. It wasn't. Made a good night fighter. There's the aerial array, which really puts it a bit out of whack to be in the Battle of Britain area, but it was the only one they had. That came much later in the conflict. There's the inverted V12. You can see crankcase, if you like, at the top, plugs, everything else is just down the bottom. Very, very good engine. The Ju-88, again as a night fighter, typically Ju-88s had a big glazed nose rather than the nose there. That aeroplane surprised me. That's the first time I've seen an actual Stuka, a Ju-87, and a really excellent aeroplane as long as there weren't any people in the sky trying to shoot it down. The Spitfires and the Hurricanes rather enjoyed those things because they were as you can imagine, a pretty horrible target. But it impressed me how big the aeroplane was. Very famous dive bomber as part of their blitzkrieg. My dad's aeroplane, the Blenheim 4, and only the second one of those that I'd ever seen. Bolt and Paul Defiant, the only one. There is another one that has been recreated out of bits. This is the genuine article. Sort of looks like a Hurricane, but it's a bit bigger with that 4-gun turret in the back. You might look at it and ask yourself, how do you get out of that? If the aeroplane was actually under control, yeah, you can get out of it. But if it's not, very, very little chance. Very difficult aeroplane to abandon. There's the detail of the aeroplane. It was very successful, of course, because the fighters used to come and attack this from the rear. Well, of course, they got a bit of a surprise because there was a 4-gun turret. Didn't take them too long to work out what it was. They attacked it from the front, so they made it a night fighter. Finally, there's the sad picture. That's the diorama of a crashed Hurricane. That was dug up, cleaned, and put it on display. A very quick walk through RAF Hendon. Should you go there now? Absolutely. How long will you spend there? As long as you possibly can. There is an absolute world to see. Thanks very much.